Boy, it's not often that I get applause lines like that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Green, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Congress established the Wilson Center 50-plus years ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. While many centers deal in data and information, Congress asked us to go further and to elevate scholarship and learning. And so our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is crafting options and ideas that decision makers can believe in. We are also the only Washington think tank to have research programs dedicated to U.S. relations with each of our immediate neighbors. Another reason that we are truly honored to host this discussion with Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. So our Canada Institute Director, Chrystia Freeland, is here today. Been running around like a crazy man. I can see he's calm. That's good. Chris, thanks to you and your team for your leadership in showcasing the crucial importance of the U.S. Canada relationship. I'd also like to thank two great Canadian companies, E3 Metals and Canadian National, for being here today and for their support of the Wilson Center's Canada work. The Prime Minister is in town, as we know, to participate in the first North American Leaders Summit since 2016. We are fortunate to have him joined as well by three leading members of his cabinet. Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. Welcome, Minister. Mary Yang, the Minister of International Trade and Export Promotion. Minister Eng, it's great to have you here in person. Earlier this year, she participated in the first anniversary celebration of the USMCA Working Group, and so it's great to see you actually face-to-face. Good to have you here. It is also our pleasure to welcome Marco Mendicino, who is Canada's new Minister of Public Safety. Again, thanks to all of you for being here. I also want to thank Ambassador David Jacobson for joining us today and serving as our moderator. Ambassador Jacobson is a member of the Wilson Center's presidentially appointed board. He's an advisor to the Canada Institute and the former U.S. Ambassador to Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, Canada and the U.S. are in the vanguard of a new kind of international relationship. Together, we are forging some of the world's most efficient supply chains. The U.S. faces a particularly troubling scenario when it comes to the supply chain for critical minerals. Fortunately for the free world, Canada is rich in several of these critical minerals. In 2020, our two countries agreed to a joint action plan on critical minerals collaboration to see that these resources are more effectively and more efficiently developed. The Wilson Center has established both a working group on critical mineral supply chains and a task force on public health at the U.S.-Canada border. This latter group aims to take stock of the economic, social, and health impacts of border restrictions. It's examining how technology and data sharing and the adoption of a risk management paradigm could mitigate those costs while improving the effectiveness and security of our land, sea, and air borders. In 2020, NAFTA was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. The USMCA liberalizes digital trade, strengthens intellectual property protections, and establishes more than 26 separate committees to coordinate implementation of the agreement by the governments involved. Our USMCA working group, which includes government representatives and other stakeholders, is closely tracking the implementation of USMCA. We're excited that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau have launched a roadmap to a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership with commitments to work together on urgent challenges from rebuilding our infrastructure to fighting COVID. Through our unique Canada Institute, Wilson is closely following the progress of the roadmap and other important matters between our two great countries. We are looking forward to hearing more about these initiatives during today's discussion. With that, Prime Minister Trudeau, welcome, and again, the floor is open to you for some comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for being here today. Quel plaisir d'être ici avec vous. Je veux commencer par quelques mots sur la situation en Colombie-Britannique. I want to start with a couple of words on an incident, on a situation that's unfolding in British Columbia right now. Over the past number of days, there have been torrential rains that have led to historic and terrible flooding that has disrupted the lives and taken lives of people across BC. I want people to know, first of all, that the federal government has been engaging with the local authorities, with the province. I spoke with the Premier, I spoke with a number of mayors last night to talk about how people are doing in this terrifically bad situation. We're also working with them on saving people, on sending resources like the Canadian Armed Forces to support people in this situation, but also we'll be there for the cleanup and the rebuilding after the impacts of these extreme weather events. It's really going to be important that Canadians continue to do what we do, which is being there for each other in this difficult situation, and we will continue to be. It's also something that has impacts south of the border that have been hit by the rains, but also as we're looking at maintaining supply chains and people are diverting around through the United States, we are working closely with our partners on the other side of the border to make sure that things work well. And it's yet another example of the fact that people are there for each other in difficult times in this long and enduring friendship between Canada and the United States. As we look to the challenges we're facing in the future, and as we look at the challenges we're facing right now, three things come to mind: ending COVID, building strong, resilient economies, and fighting climate change. And those are three of the things that I look forward to speaking with, amongst many other things today, with all of you. First of all, on ending COVID, Canada and the U.S. have been working together, as would be expected, not just with partnerships on healthcare and research, on supply chains that continue to flow across the border, even though the border was closed to non-essential travel for about a year and a half. We were able to keep things going in a way that supports people on both sides of the border. And we've also been working together on getting vaccines to the world and in partnering to make sure that this global crisis is seen through in the best possible way. And that's yet another example of ways in which Canada and the U.S. are aligned. We've also obviously working together on the rebuilding post-COVID, and that means getting supply lines and supply chains back up and running after having paused our economies for significant periods of time, after seeing significant disruptions, as we work to stand up for workers and create better prosperity and jobs as we recover from this pandemic, and as we look to continue to defend our communities, our democracies, our principles, our values in a world that has been significantly disrupted. And one of the things that continues to disrupt is the advent of climate change. That's why I was so pleased to be in Glasgow a few weeks ago, positioning Canada again as a significant leader in the fight against climate change. The U.S. leadership over these past 10 months has been extraordinarily important for the world, but we all have to be stepping up. Canada has actually moved forward with putting a price on pollution, and we won 2 elections on it as well, so it can be done that you put a price on carbon pollution and support families as we move towards transforming our energy mixes. We've also we're putting a cap on our oil and gas industry and going to be reducing the emissions there as well. These are the kinds of things that we need to do at home, but also with partners continentally, but also around the world, and we're going to continue to keep working on this. Il y a beaucoup de grands enjeux sur lesquels on est en train de travailler, que ce soit la vaccination, que ce soit l'économie, que ce soit la lutte contre les changements climatiques. On va continuer de le faire en partenariat, because we do better things when we're all working together together, and that's what Canada-U.S. relations have been all about, and that's what we're going to continue to work on over the coming years. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.
I'm really looking forward to getting to the Q&A, though.
Yeah, and let me add my welcome to you and to Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and to Minister Ng and Minister Mendicino. Welcome to Washington. Welcome to the Wilson Center for what pretend to be very important days in the relationship between the United States and Canada and Mexico. Just so we have, and also welcome to all of you. You know, when I look out at all these young people and people who are excited about foreign affairs and international relations, it just gives me so much hope. And we are expecting lots of good questions from you, and the procedure is going to be there are microphones on both sides in the aisle. When you have a question, get up in line, and I'll be calling on you. But to get things started, I've got a couple, and while everybody kind of gets organized, and I want to start with a general one, Prime Minister, and that is that the relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the United States is critical to all of us. But many people are surprised to learn about the extent of the relationship. You know, there are about $2 million worth of goods and services that cross our two borders, north and south border, every minute. The United States trades more with its two neighbors than it does with the EU and the UK combined, almost twice as much as our trade with China. The United States is by far the largest trading partner with both Canada and Mexico. And the estimates, and they range probably from 12 million, I've heard, up to 18 million jobs that are dependent on the trade between our two countries. And with the importance of that relationship in mind, how do you plan to use your meetings with the President and with President Lopez Obrador to make those relationships even stronger?
Well, I think, first of all, you've laid it out well. The figure that we remember and put forward in Canada most is $2 billion every single day in value of goods and services crossing our border with the United States. And when the pandemic hit, for example, one of our big priorities was, of course, keeping people safe. But part of keeping people safe is making sure that the flow of essential goods and services, and quite frankly, consumer goods and everything that you could possibly imagine, continued despite the fact that we were shutting down the border. And that's where the cooperation and the integration of our economies made for extremely good working and alignment that was able to continue to have things go even in an unprecedented event, because we have such deep connections in supply chains, in reliance, in partnerships. I mean, one of the issues that I pointed out when we were looking at possible disruptions of medical supplies coming from the United States to Canada was there are thousands of nurses and doctors across Canada who every day go down to work in hospitals and health centers in the United States, and that it is a two-way street that we do well when we're working together. And I think the emphasis that we're going to have in this in these meetings today isn't just that, oh, it's in Canada's interest to continue the smooth flow of goods and services across our border. It's also very much in the United States' interests. The jobs that are created and maintained because of integrated supply chains across our border in everything from autos to high-level manufacturing to goods and services to natural resources to energy, all these different things that flow back and forth with this reliable relationship and friendship that has lasted for years. It is in our mutual interest to ensure that that continues, not just to go as it did, but at a time when supply chains are disrupted around the world, where people are rethinking, well, where are we getting things from, and what happens if there are breakdowns, either political or geographic or climate related? how do we ensure resilience in our supply chains? Well, go back to the critical minerals example, the U.S. Could do worse than rely on its closest friend, its oldest friend, its most reliable friend for ensuring that we're able to be strong and resilient in a North American context in an unstable world.
You know, you mentioned critical minerals, and I have been struck as I've thought about that of it's not a problem but an incredible opportunity for both of us. They exist in the ground in both countries. There is a need to be able to refine them in both countries. Is this one of the things you expect to talk with President Biden about?
It's a conversation that we started actually 2 or 3 years ago about the fact that we recognize that so much of our new technologies, whether it's batteries for electric vehicles or ingredients in high-tech manufacturing processes, rely on a certain number of critical and rare earth minerals. There are about 13 critical minerals that have been identified for various manufacturing processes that Canada has, that U.S. doesn't have nearly as much of, and that we are happy to provide in a reliable trade as a reliable source for the kind of growth we have. Right now, many of those critical minerals have been cornered by certain parts of the world that are somewhat less reliable these days in how they are willing and able to rely to provide reliable supply chains to the United States, to the Western world. And recognizing that, yes, as we develop critical mineral capacity for things like lithium and cobalt and nickel and other things that are so essential in technologies of the present and the future, we can't compete with some countries when it comes to low cost of production because they don't care about environmental standards or because they don't have the same labor standards and requirements that we have. It's going to be more expensive to mine those and process them in Canada than it would be in some other countries. But that's a trade-off that I think people are waking up to, particularly post-pandemic, is probably more than worth it if we can have reliable sources from best friends like Canada and Australia in minerals that are so necessary for the future of our economies. And that's sort of the approach that we're taking on this, that we're going to need to draw in global investment and secure partnerships to do this, but there's an opportunity here to create the kind of resilience in our essential supply chains that the pandemic has shown us aren't necessarily the case right now.
You know, I said on critical minerals once that if you like the Arab oil embargo in the 70s, you'll love what will happen if we don't invest in critical minerals, because it's equally important. Okay, I want to encourage all of you with all your great questions, having challenged you to get up to the microphones, but while you're doing that, one of the values that I know you and President Biden share is in creating lots of good middle-class jobs and in economic fairness. And how are you going to use and what can you do with the United States and with Mexico in order to foster that? And what are you guys going to be talking about over the next couple of days?
Well, a great example of that is understanding that labor standards, that environmental standards, that emissions control and the way we do things are going to be an essential part of how we move forward, and making sure that we're not competing in a race to the bottom amongst friends, that we're reflecting the same kinds of high expectations for good jobs, well-paying careers, even as our world transforms, is something that we should be leaning in on. But I mean, that's certainly something that our Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has been leaning in on very directly. So I'd love to turn it over to you for reflections on how we move forward on an economy that works for both of us and for our citizens.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. And I'll just mention 3 quick points. You know, the Prime Minister started by talking about how avoiding a race to the bottom is how we can together support our middle classes. And a great example of that is the OECD tax deal that puts a floor on corporate taxation. And that is something that Canada and the United States and many of our other allies worked really, really hard on. That is going to be really transformative of how global capitalism works. And it's going to help all of us in our own countries do something that Canada very much believes in, which is having policies that support inclusive growth and support the middle class. The Prime Minister mentioned labor and support for working people. And that's something that the Prime Minister, it's one of the reasons the Prime Minister was elected in 2015, is he was really the first leader to bring that focus on the middle class to the center of Canadian politics. And in our new NAFTA trade agreement, the labor standards are novel and very important, and that's something that we really look forward to reinforcing in our conversations with the Biden administration. And then I'll say just one final thing, which is something each country can do at home, but is definitely a value that Canada shares with the US. And that is, we really believe in childcare as a great way to support middle-class families, to support affordability for middle-class families, and to help resolve the labor shortage, which is an issue in both of our economies. And actually, the Prime Minister and I were together in Edmonton on Monday, where the Prime Minister announced our 9th deal with a Canadian province and territory. We now have early learning and childcare deals that cover 60% of children in Canada. Within 5 years, daycare in Canada will be $10 a day. And for us, that is a very, very powerful economic policy. We know it's something the Biden administration is focused on too. And I think we look forward to kind of sharing experiences there.
Sounds good. All right, let's go to the audience, and I'm going to try and alternate sides here. I'm not sure we'll get through everybody's, but this gentleman over here.
Thank you. So I want to start off by saying that it's an absolute honor to be in front of you, Prime Minister. I'm a big fan of many of the things that you have accomplished and that you stand for as well. For my question, when it comes to how the U.S. and Canada are currently dealing with the ongoing climate crisis, in what ways can both countries improve? And do you think personally, are we doing enough? And if no, I also would like to ask, why are we not doing enough?
Well, I think, first of all, there's always more to do. And we have to be extremely ambitious, and not just ambitious on our way to COP. We have to be ambitious on our way out of COP and in how we approach next year. And I think one of the key things is continuing to scale up our ambition to meet the scale of the challenge we're facing is not something that we're ever going to finish doing. We have to keep doing it. But we have to position it in ways that bring citizens and communities and our economy along. And that's where one of the things that we did when I first got elected in 2015, we brought in a broad-based price on pollution in our country. It is no longer free to pollute anywhere in Canada. And there have been lots of talks about carbon tax and carbon pricing, and some countries have moved forward with a little bit, but we have a price on pollution that's going to rise to $170 a ton by 2030, which makes it one of the strongest and broad-based prices in the world. And the way we did it is we're actually returning more money to the average family than it costs them on average for the carbon price. So it's a way of actually bringing in a price on pollution that if people don't change their behaviors, they end up slightly better off. If they actually change their behaviors to buy a more fuel-efficient car or fix their windows or upgrade their furnace, they actually save much more money because the money we return to them is a larger amount. So that was the trick around carbon pricing that allowed us to bring in something that, yes, the Conservatives in Canada fought us all the way to the Supreme Court saying that we couldn't do this, but we ended up not just winning at the Supreme Court, we won 2 elections where the votes were strongly for our party and other parties that supported carbon pricing, and that's sort of a settled question in Canada now. Now, The challenge is to bring in carbon pricing around the world, because it's not fair that Canadian industries, for example, are producing, to take an example, some of the cleanest aluminum in the world that are competing against people who are using coal-fired energy plants to produce aluminum that can offer a lower price for their aluminum than we can, even though we're protecting the planet with ours. So we have to look at making sure that we're all working on the same competitive playing field. And part of that is the conversations I've been having with people at the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, the WTO, and the European Union and others on how we move forward with a minimum standard on pricing pollution around the world, which I think is the next big step we should take to make sure that it's fair and that we're rewarding those companies, those consumers, those countries that are doing the right thing on reducing pollution and pricing it so that it doesn't happen as much.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
All right, let's go over here.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your comments so far, Mr. Prime Minister. It's great to be here. My question has to do with a central component of the North American economies, the auto industry. And I believe you've touched on this a bit already with your comments on critical minerals, but I was wondering, what do you think the United States, Mexico, and Canada should do so that North American automakers are not held back by semiconductor shortages in Asia? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. And one of the things that we've been looking at, as I've said just earlier, is we have reserves of lithium, of cobalt, of nickel, of many of the critical minerals necessary in the production of batteries for electric vehicles. And we are developing those battery supply chains in Canada because we know that that's going to be a key path forward. We have put forward a very ambitious plan that aligns with the United States on making sure that all new vehicles bought and sold in the in Canada by 2035 are zero-emission vehicles, with half of all the vehicles, 50% of them in 2030. So we're moving aggressively towards that. We've already seen significant investments by automakers in electric vehicle production in Canada. The auto market, the auto manufacturing market in Canada, United States, and Mexico is extraordinarily well integrated, has been for 50 years since the Auto Pact was signed, and it is both more efficient for production in Canada and the United States. It makes us more competitive around the world, and it creates great jobs right across the continent. When we signed the USMCA, we actually ensured that not only are we protecting those jobs well into the future, we're also demanding a higher level of wages that is going to bring up the wage standards in Mexico and allow them to flourish as part of this. So this is all the exciting things. We are a little bit concerned about the zero-emission vehicle mandates or rebates brought forward in the current by the current proposal in Congress right now that could have a real negative impact on the Auto Pact, but that's part of the conversations we're going to have today to make sure that people understand that doing this together is good for all of us, good for the jobs, good for the future as we fight climate change, as we build prosperity in North America.
Thank you.
All right, back over here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Mariana. I am a Master of Public Policy candidate at American University. I identify as a North Americanist, having been born in Mexico, raised in the U.S., but having the pleasure to work on North American relation portfolio. My question to you is the inclusion of Chapter 24 in the USMCA regarding the environment further links trade to the environment. So with that, how do you see the energy transition in Canada?
Well, Canada is a major oil and gas producing country. It is something that has always been part of our makeup as a country. We are a country of vast spaces of great natural resources and energy resources, but we recognize that the world needs to hit net zero, that Canada needs to hit net zero by 2050, that we have to transform our energy mix. And of course, we are innovating in massive ways around transforming the way we produce energy. We're decarbonizing the processes now. We've committed to capping emissions on oil and gas production in our country and reducing it to hit that net zero. And that's also the attitude we brought forward when we negotiated the renewed USMCA. But the person who was so involved daily in negotiating it is sitting beside me, so I will turn to Chrystia for further thoughts on USMCA and energy and environment.
Yeah, well, Prime Minister, as is so often the case, you've really said it all. The only thing I will add for Mariana, because it sounds like this is a real area of interest of yours, is, look, Canada is a trading nation. We believe in free trade. We think it makes everyone richer. But I think people's ideas of trade that works have changed. And Canada certainly recognizes we need high quality, fair trade. So we need trade agreements that support high paying union jobs in Canada and in our trading partners. That's a value we share with the US. We need trading agreements that do not create a race to the bottom on the environment, but quite the contrary, create and support a race to the top. We need, and I think this is an area where we will have more and more conversations. The Prime Minister has really been pioneering in setting a price on pollution in Canada. He was sort of gentle about the process in Canada, but he bears a lot of scars. It was a real fight. And one of the things that Canada is going to be focused on, and I think the whole world will be, is where countries that have established that are going to have to figure out how to create a global environment that doesn't punish you for putting a price on pollution, but that creates a level playing field. And that is something we've had some great conversations with the US on, with the EU on. I think we're going to have to really step up there.
Thank you.
All right, over here.
Hi, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's greatly appreciated. What has been spoken on this afternoon has been Canada's vast natural resources, many of which lie in territories claimed by Canada's Indigenous people, 40% of whose households are food insecure, and a third of which, represent a third of Canada's federal prison population. What is the Canadian government doing to address the historic and continuing injustices against the Indigenous population? And to what extent are they willing to address that if it harms Canada's ability to provide minerals?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. It's not a question I get often enough outside of Canada's borders. How countries around the world, including Canada, treat and partner with Indigenous peoples is of deep, deep importance to me. The idea that people make of Canada is as a nice place, a fair place, a reasonable place, a polite place, all those stereotypes are things that Canadians take pride in too as well. But it has become increasingly obvious over the past years and decade that we were falling down, that we had not lived up to the idea we like to make of Canada in terms of our relations with Indigenous people. Yes, health and socioeconomic outcomes are way worse for Indigenous people. There is a deep, deep unfairness in the way Canada functions that we have been extremely serious about transforming over the past 6 years. And that involves everything from making sure, as we have, that there is parity, that kids in Indigenous communities get just as much invested in them as non-Indigenous kids get in terms of schooling, that we're investing in healthcare, that we're investing in economic partnerships, that we're investing in ending the boil water advisories that continue in too many parts of the country in Indigenous communities, which is the irony that people who've always lived off the land can no longer drink the water that flows past their homes. These are the kinds of things that we have been very, very serious about tackling in every different way, which is why we signed on to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, why we are moving forward on historic, not just apologies, but compensations for wrongs done. One of the key things that we're dealing with right now is the fact that for much of the 20th century, residential schools were established as a way of trying to assimilate Indigenous peoples, remove their languages, remove their culture, their traditions, and what it ended up doing is just causing intergenerational devastation, loss of identity, loss of culture, loss of hope for so many people that thanks to the strength and resilience of elders and community leaders, they were able to hang on to. And now we need to continue to invest, to support, to move forward in a way that recognizes that past. One of the current challenges we're facing is, you talked about the prison population, but in terms of foster children, foster care, the percentages of Indigenous kids who were removed from their communities, from situations at risk, and taken from their language and cultures, and therefore have terrible outcomes and suffered abuse currently, are things that we have to fix. We just signed some of the first agreements that return kids at risk to the care of their communities, that will allow kids who are growing up in vulnerable situations to be cared for in their language, in their culture, by giving resources and finances to Indigenous leaders and communities to be able to do that. But there's an awful lot of work to do. The pace of change is too slow for us, too slow for Indigenous peoples, but it has to be done in partnership, in respect. That always takes a little longer, but we are very much focused on fixing the broken relationships that Canada has had with Indigenous peoples, and we're making progress, but there's lots more to do, but we're committed to doing it. So thank you very, very much for allowing me to share that.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're back on starboard.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister, and thank you for taking our questions. I was just wondering, the climate summit ended about 2 weeks ago, right? It was announced, or it was reported today, that the Biden administration is planning on selling about 80 million acres of the Gulf of Mexico for off-sea oil drilling. I was wondering if you believe it's hypocritical of the Biden administration to make this move when the United States considers itself a global leader on climate change.
I think every country has its challenges. As I said, we are a major oil and gas producer in our country, and we are going to continue to produce oil and gas for the coming years while the world continues to rely on it. And we have to figure out how to decarbonize that and ensure we're continuing with good jobs for families, good careers, as we lean on those experts in the energy industry in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and other places that have the expertise to be able to transform our energy mix. It's a hard thing for Canada to do, but it's something that Canadians have spoken up clearly in elections and in public opinions that they expect, and we're doing. When I took office in 2015, I took over from a Conservative government that didn't do much at the federal level on the fight against climate change. So we had to make up for some lost time on that, and we were able to do it. But we leaned heavily on provinces who'd done phasing out coal. We'd leaned heavily on municipalities that did some of that work too. But it's not easy. And I think everyone needs to be pushing hard to figure out the right ways that suit their economy and protect their citizens and their careers for the future. So I'm not going to weigh in on what the U.S. is or isn't doing. I will just say that it's hard, but it's absolutely necessary, and people need to walk the talk on the fight against climate change. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually bring in a price on pollution, because that's a simple market mechanism that rewards innovators and companies that do the right things in their shifts, and rewards citizens for making the choices that are smart around that.
Thank you.
All right, over here.
Prime Minister Trudeau, before I begin, I just wanted to say that your sock game is absolutely fire right now. It looks great. I've seen it multiple times. It looks amazing.
These are my McGill socks, actually, so yeah.
Ask the question.
My son went to McGill.
All right, but to get into the question, Prime Minister Trudeau, over the past decade, we have seen China rise as a global power. They are the only country with the economic, diplomatic, and military and technological power that could pose a challenge to the current international system. Now, we all know about China's fake COVID statistics, the current Uyghur genocide, and the tensions in trade between Canada and China. How will you and the Liberal Party confront China's economic abuses, counter its aggressive and coercive actions, and push back on China's attack on human rights, intellectual property, and global governance?
Very clear question.
That's an easy one.
There you go. Well, I think part of what you started with is China is in French we'd say un incontournable. It is a very, very strong and present player in the global economy, in the international community that we absolutely have to deal with. And there are things that we need to directly contest China on, whether it's human rights, whether it's democracy, whether it's a range of things. There are things that we need to compete with China on, whether it's economic or trade issues. And there are areas in which we're going to have to try and find ways to work together, like on climate. But the key is going to be that we need to work together as like-minded nations on this issue, that no single country, not even the United States, with all its importance and economic strength and might, is able on its own to counter some of the behaviors and the engagements that China has. And when we work together as Western democracies, we get things done. I mean, one of the key examples for Canadians is for almost 3 years, we had 2 Canadian citizens arbitrarily detained by China in direct retaliation for us fulfilling our obligations under a long-established extradition treaty with our closest friend and neighbor, the United States. We fulfilled our terms of an international treaty, and China came down on us and arbitrarily arrested 2 Canadian citizens and detained them in very difficult conditions for about 3 years. And what happened through those 3 years is, first of all, we worked very closely with the United States, for whom we were doing the important role of fulfilling our extradition treaty to try and solve this. But countries around the world, allied countries and countries that you wouldn't expect, actually made a point of, when they sat down with Chinese leadership, pointing out, oh yeah, and we're really worried about those two Canadians you have arrested. And the reaction of the Chinese interlocutors in that point was usually quite upset that they were bringing up some random issue with Canadians, but the world stood together and highlighted that this is an important principle of standing against coercive diplomacy that we are united on. And partly that pressure, partly the great partnership with the United States was able to return those 2 Michaels to Canada. But it is an example of the fact that we need to be aligned, we need to be working together, whether it's on critical minerals or whether it's understanding that we can't be necessarily just competing with each other, trying to argue with trying to get better access for our agricultural goods or pork to the Chinese market and compete against some of our fellow countries in a ways that divides us. We have to be much more aligned, concerted, and strategic about making sure we're standing up for our interests and our values in a way that is unignorable, even for a country the size and scale of China.
Thank you.
All right, over here, and I apologize, looking at the length of the lines, I'm sure we could be here until Friday. But I think we're going to have time for one more over here after this one.
Actually, let's take 2 more. 2 more on either side. We got more.
So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. It's an honor to be here today as a George Mason undergraduate student of international relations. My question is sort of similar to the last one, speaking of the same region. One of the things you hear a lot about if you study international relations in this country is what we call the pivot to Asia, the emphasis, change in emphasis by the Biden administration and to some degree the Trump administration on focusing on our strategy in Asia. One of the things you talk a lot about is, you talked a lot about today, is USMCA. But given the pivot to Asia, is it something that you're going to be discussing with President Biden that maybe the U.S. and Canada should be trading more with East Asia and maybe even walk back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, first of all, Canada is a signatory to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We actually moved forward with it, and through it became the only G7 country with a free trade deal with every other G7 country. Canada has free trade access to about 2/3 of the global economy, and we did that at a time where there are real concerns around globalization and trade because we were putting environmental standards, labor standards, and high expectations on those trade deals, including on the renamed Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we are doing it, and quite frankly, just last night we got another piece of good news on that I will turn over to our Minister of International Trade and Small Business to talk about.
Well, thanks so very much, Prime Minister. And last evening, I was meeting with the ASEAN ministers in the region, and we have agreed to proceed with a free trade agreement with the ASEAN region. So building on the CPTPP to create greater access for Canadian businesses, and I'm the Minister of both small businesses and international trade. And why is that important as well for our trade agreements, particularly for those that we just decided to work on with the ASEAN? It's because in addition to provisions for high standards on the environment and on labor, also chapters that provide greater access to those markets for small and medium-sized businesses, also for women and gender and those businesses represented by typically underrepresented businesses because they're small. So this is very much an opportunity to grow our economy. And what are we really talking about? ASEAN is the third largest consumer market in the world. In addition to the 2/3 access right now through the many free trade agreements that Canada has, it really is also building out another 600 million customers in that region. So as a Pacific nation, it really is important for us to continue to pursue those opportunities. And for us, it's about people, it's about exporters, and it's about being able to create opportunities for them to grow. And I can't think of a more important time than right now as we are building out of COVID-19 and recovering our economies. And this is an area where we absolutely are very, very simpatico with the United States on.
Yeah, and ASEAN is, it's going beyond just Japan and South Korea and others. It's looking at countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, a whole range of Philippines. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that for people who are following along at home.
Thank you.
All right, last one over here. I apologize to all.
No. We got more time. We take
all right,
three
we're
more.
gonna keep going.
There was
Stay in
a
line.
longer introduction than there should have been.
Stay in
so
line.
okay.
Don't go anywhere. Over here.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. The anti-Asian hate crimes have risen very rapidly in both the United States and Canada during the era of COVID-19. My question is, what are the steps you intend to take and the solutions your administration can propose in order to further tackle this issue?
Well, first of all, Canada is a country like the United States that has grown from immigration. We are an extraordinary diverse country that has actually figured out that differences and diversity is actually a source of strength and resilience as opposed to being a source of fault lines and tensions in our country. And Canada is one of those rare places in the world where one of our biggest political challenges is, Canadians keep telling us, no, you need to bring in more immigrants. You need to bring in more people to Canada because they create jobs, because they create prosperity for us. And that is something that we do. And I want to turn to Marco, who's our Minister of Public Safety, who was just our Minister of Immigration, to say a few words on this. But we need to make sure that it's not just about bringing people in, it's about integrating them and empowering them and respecting them and creating communities that themselves stand up for each other and embrace diversity. And what we've seen in terms of the rise of intolerance and hatred anti-Asian racism during this pandemic, but anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism has been a real challenge over the past years. The pandemic has certainly exacerbated it with all the mental health issues and the tensions and the anxieties people are feeling. But we've seen polarizations and challenges over the past years in our communities that Canada is not immune to. We've really had to crack down on right-wing radicalization, listed right-wing organizations as terrorist organizations, and really making sure we're giving voice to the vast majority of Canadians who are decent and open and stand against intolerance in very concrete ways. But Marco, both as former Immigration Minister and Minister of Public Safety, I know you've got a lot to say on this.
A few hats. Thanks, Prime Minister. And I do think there is a way to bridge the two concepts that you've already touched on. One is the reality that we are seeing more hate and racism in a variety of forums, both in person, in schools, on campuses, in the workplace, in our communities, and increasingly online. And that is something that our government is very much grasped with as we come up with a framework to work with big tech and other corporate citizens to really root out the content which we know represents a clear and present danger to those simply by virtue of who they are. But I will say on the immigration front, which was something that I had the honor of shepherding for the last 2 years, I'm very proud of the fact that this year we're going to land 401,000 new permanent residents in Canada, which is a little more than 1% of our total domestic population. Now, why is that important? Because of the labor shortages that we're experiencing. And this is an area of real strategic collaboration, I think, with the United States at the border, and something that we hope to address. I will also just say, in conclusion, that human rights and what we're seeing in Afghanistan right now, and Canada's role in extracting those who were targeted by the Taliban, is something that we are very proud that we did in conjunction with the United States. Secretary Blinken, Secretary Mayorkas, the Biden administration worked very closely with us to help evacuate many Afghans who supported the Canadian mission during those years that we were there to try and build a brighter future for Afghans. And now those Afghans who we've been able to repatriate to Canada have the chance at a better life. And I think all of this is good in addressing the great diversity that we are proud of. So I think it's a fantastic question, and thank you for posing it.
Thank you.
All right, the bar's been set high. Over here.
And with that, Prime Minister, thank you for the extra time, first of all. But also thank you to the entire delegation for coming. It really is encouraging to me that this is going to be a working summit where you go deep into the issues, and so I'm very, very positive about that. My name is Adam Hempill. I'm with Walmart, and I wanted to come back to sustainability because it's such an important issue. Canada was well represented at COP, and I wondered if you could reflect a little bit about how to work or how private sector can be part of the solutions of the aspiration around post-Glasgow. And then going into the summit, I just wanted to ask, do you expect that there will be any friction as a result of Canada's victory over Mexico in the qualifying match for the World Cup?
Well, you know, it's rare that Canada's weather works in our favor, but the snow on the pitch last night in Edmonton that led to a 2-1 victory by the Canadian national soccer team over the Mexicans for the first time in history was a very nice thing that I hope you know, President López Obrador will forgive me for.
Timing is everything.
It is. It was just a great victory. Listen, the private sector has an essential role to play in the fight against climate change and in the transformation of our economy in very, very meaningful ways. Yes, governments can put forward billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars to the fight against climate change. But private money can put forward, and you know, businesses can put forward trillions and tens of trillions of dollars towards the transformation of our economy, towards the updating of our supply chains, towards you know, getting us moving in the right direction. The forces that we can draw on as consumers in the choices we make, as leaders, as employers, all these things need to be working together if we're going to meet the challenge we have, and that's certainly something that we're very much looking at and working on. And I know, Chrystia, you've been working directly on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add there is, we very much believe and understand that the government has the responsibility to set the framework. The Prime Minister has been very clear with our price on pollution, rising to $170 a ton by 2030. And we also know we have to make some government investments in this transition. This is the biggest change in our industrialized economy, our global industrialized economy, since the Industrial Revolution itself. We should not underestimate, any of us, the scale of the transformation. And we are investing. Our government has invested $100 billion in the climate transition since we first formed government. But we know that our government, no government in the world is going to do it alone. And what do we need business to do? We need you guys to push really, really hard to net zero as fast as you can, to push with your suppliers, to push in the work you do, in how you transport your goods. And then we need the financial sector to really get behind significantly investing in the green transition. And that's something that the Prime Minister and, with the team, the Prime Minister really led at Glasgow in terms of really encouraging global finance and Canadian investors to move aggressively into that space.
All right, we're going to go back over here, and this is the last one. So you've got the floor.
Yeah, good afternoon, Prime Minister. I'm Sharik Faruqi. I'm a final year student at George Washington University studying international affairs, gender studies, and public health. I'm also an intern with the Wilson Center's Maternal Health Initiative. And the thing that I wanted to ask is that we really talked about impacts on Indigenous communities with climate change. But I think it's really important to turn our eyes to the global south. And since climate change disproportionately affects those communities, especially with communities facing environmental injustices in Palestine, I think I was curious to see what Canada can do in terms of, siding and helping and supporting minority communities such as in Palestine who are facing environmental apartheid and injustice. So I wanted to see what the Canadian government has done so far to help these countries that do not have the resources that Canada and the U.S. has. Thank you.
One of the fundamental realities and unfairnesses of climate change is the countries least responsible and the people least responsible for contributing to it over the past number of decades are the ones who are most sensitive and most devastated by the impacts of climate change, whether it's extreme weather events, whether it's heat waves or droughts or what have you. There's so much more vulnerability. Think of the small island developing states that are faced with rising sea levels and increased storms without the means to actually pay for it or manage through it and defend against it the way wealthier countries have. So at the same time as we do that, the developed world is quite rightly saying, oh my God, the science is clear. We have to reduce our carbon emissions. We have to stop burning coal everywhere around the world. We have to transform our energy mixes. We have to change the way we do things. And the developing world, the emerging markets, whether it's India or others or much smaller countries around the world, are saying, yeah, we can't afford to run our country off of solar power and batteries. We need these coal plants, we need these diesel plants, we need to have energy to be able to create jobs and prosperity and stability and security for our citizens. And you can't tell us that we can't open coal plants because you opened too many of them over the 20th century and spoiled it for the rest of us. So the developed world has a direct and essential responsibility to fund the energy transition in places around the world that can't otherwise afford it, so that we can fight climate change. And at the Paris Climate Conference, there was a commitment made around $100 billion a year in climate financing for emerging markets in the developing world. We haven't yet hit that $100 billion target yet. But in the approach to Glasgow, Canada and Germany and a couple of other countries have been pushing really, really hard, and we're now finally going to hit that $100 billion mark, I think in the beginning of 2023. That $100 billion a year will flow for climate financing to help countries not open new power plants. And this is something that we've been working on, even though we didn't hit it. I saw the number, I think there's about 70 different coal power plants that would have opened up over the past year that didn't around the world because of investments made by the global north. But there's an awful lot more to do. And understanding, as the pandemic has shown us how connected we are and how we need to respond immediately and everywhere to a crisis, the climate change crisis, which is slightly slower moving but even more dire than the pandemic has been, requires us collectively to step up and lead beyond our own narrow interests and understand that the choices we make as individual consumers, as voters, as communities, as countries, will determine what this planet looks like in 2050 and whether our kids and our kids' kids not just have clean air and fresh water and the kind of quality of life we expect, but also have the kinds of good jobs and careers that they have every right to expect. We need to step up and stop thinking that what matters is just what we do narrowly. Of course it does. It matters what we do, but it also matters what we allow and enable other countries to do, to leapfrog over the mistakes that we made to get to that better future. And that's the collective responsibility of leadership on climate change that I'm so pleased to be seeing from President Biden and Ambassador Kerry and Secretary Kerry and others. But there's a lot more work to do with like-minded countries around the world, and all of us are part of doing it.
Prime Minister, before we wrap up, you have any closing thoughts for the folks out there?
Just what a real pleasure it is to be here with all of you. Thank you for taking time to gather here today to listen to us, to show an interest in global relations, in the Canada-U.S. relationship, in the future that we are building together. If there is anything that has become increasingly clear over the past year and a half, it's how small the world has gotten and how interconnected we are, and how the kinds of thinking that brought us to this point are going to need to be replaced with a different kind of thinking more long-term, thinking broader about the impacts on the other side of the world, the choices we make, not just around climate change, not just around health outcomes, but around economic prosperity, around human rights, around how the world is so interconnected that we all have a role to play. The challenge for Americans specifically is you've got so much going on at home. It's easy for you not to be looking around the world. Canada has the advantage of being small enough that we're always looking across the border at what you guys are doing, but also around the world as well. And the more we can all, as individuals in fortunate democracies like Canada and the United States, the more we can think about the impact and therefore the responsibility we have for the world, the better off our kids and our kids' kids and future generations will be by shifting our thinking to a way that will really make a difference for the future. That's what Canada's doing, not easily, not without its own challenges at home, but that's what we need to keep doing as a world, and that's what we will do alongside this amazing team and this great cabinet that we have working hard on it back home. Merci beaucoup, mes amis.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, ministers. Thanks all of you for joining us. It's a great day.